So let's make a start. Before the break, you'll remember we were talking about mimesis, the idea that when we read, there's a tendency for imitation of what is being read. That is, mimesis says that just as when people see someone like pin being put in, they feel the pain. When people read, they're feeling and imitating in their mind. They're imagining what's happening and they're applying it in their own lives. And philosophers of language like Paul Ricoeur in France say that often the very interesting thing that's happening in terms of literature is not just what the authors are doing, not just what the text is doing, but what the reader is doing with the text. And as Christians, Paul Ricoeur would say that God is working in every person's life in different ways. And so every person might read the same biblical text, but it could be having very different influences if they live in different places, in different cultures, in different settings. If they're young, they're old, then the same passage could be having different influences in different ways. This helps, of course, address the question that sometimes we find is you go and listen to a sermon in one church and you go to another church at another time, you hear an entirely different message based on the same passage. Can the passage have these different meanings? And Paul Ricoeur would say, in one sense it can. There is the original intended meaning that the author wanted to communicate, and that's very important. Scholars have got to study that and study historical background and cultural context. That's very important. But it's also important to understand what's going on in the lives of the readers as they read that. And as we go through from the original Exodus, Moses, 1400 BC, to a second Exodus after captivity in Babylon coming back, and then Luke describing Jesus leading another Exodus, we have the possibility that there are readers who are rereading and reapplying God's word to them and literature to them as we go through. And a term that's sometimes used here is mimesis, a Greek word which can be interpreted as imitation in reading. That is, you are mimicking what you are reading. And so Paul Ricoeur is very famous for using these concepts to apply to the identity of people. And in his writing, Personal Identity and Narrative Identity, he looks at the possibility that when you read, it shapes thoughts you have about what is your life journey, what's it mean for you. And we mentioned before the break that narrative therapy, if you want to Google that, seeks to look at poor narratives that people have about themselves that are quite negative, and then better narratives that people have about themselves that are quite positive. Now, of course, you can make two errors here. One is to say that you are not as good as you actually are. Then the other is to say, I'm so wonderful. You know, I'll be in the Olympics next year. I'm president of the USA. So you've got to be careful you don't go to the other extreme. And we probably need a balance, don't we, in the middle. So Paul Ricoeur is talking about narrative identity. And he says that many of the stories we read have a sense of identity that's being communicated. One way they communicate this is through the characters in the story. And you've got to think through whether the characters are good characters or weak characters. And then the other way is through through characters that we try to avoid as well, aren't there? Take a moment now. Can you think of who are some heroes in your life, characters that you would like to be like? And you might want to think a little bit about why. Can I get everyone to write down who's a hero in your life, someone that you perhaps would like to be like? So here's a little exercise. Can I get you to write down who is a hero in your life? Someone that you'd like to be right. For me, it's N.T. Wright. Anyone know who N.T. Wright is? He's the New Testament scholar who's over in England. So he just seems to have a good use of language and good knowledge. And so you can borrow that if you wish to write down into right. Yeah. Any thoughts there? Eh? No, not at all. Could be anyone. Yeah. Any thoughts? Any thoughts? Yes, I think G.K. Chesterton is quite amazing. Yeah. Any thoughts why you like G.K. Chesterton?
We find the whole like way rise and presenting other people in many ways, and especially found because like also it's like even how much he was as well and how and also,
Yes.
Roger's is kind of very widespread and he's quite easy to go into spaces where you go quite within the paradoxical things that don't really make sense yet until you go through them.
Yeah. So notice how both his life journey is a bit of a story that one appeals, and it tends to speak into your life. But notice also how the way he does things, one tends to imitate. Mimesis, isn't it? That's happening there. Kayla, can we ask you and then possibly Melissa and Catherine, what are heroes that you can think of? Kayla?
I don't know if you know much about Elizabeth Elliot, but she was Jim Elliot's wife, and I find her really fascinating in that story because of the forgiveness towards the people who murdered her husband. Yeah, I think that's just pretty astounding.
And Kayla, do you think that influences your life in some way, seeing them as a hero, both their life journey and also things that they've written and said?
Yeah, definitely. I think that whole story is very amazing, what they went and what they did, but also the people who survived and their response to that situation, particularly like Elizabeth Elliot and her, I guess, just forgiveness and love towards everyone, regardless of what they had done towards her. Yeah, pretty amazing.
And interesting, Kayla, because there's a whole package goes with the admiration that one gives to that literature and listening to it, which includes missions work. Are there other things that tend to influence your view of life and your life journey through this story that has impacted your life?
Sorry, what do you mean by that question?
I was just thinking, does this mean that you're possibly thinking of doing missions work? Are you thinking of doing sort of local missions work as well as a result of seeing Elliot as a hero?
I think not necessarily as a result, but I'd say it probably, influenced my worldview a lot, how she responded to people, and then sort of looking at why she did that, and that's coming from a love from God, and then that influencing my own worldview and going, that kind of forgiveness isn't possible on your own merit. That has to be coming from God flowing through you.
And it becomes a dialogue partner, doesn't it? We have these heroes in our lives and we read their works and we dialogue with them. And so this indicates that the literatures we read, like the Bible, aren't just one-way literatures, but they are dialoguing literatures. And I think Paul Ricoeur is giving us ideas along those lines a little bit. Melissa, what are your thoughts on a hero and how that hero has influenced you?
I don't know. I was trying to think, and then I remember because I used to read, like growing up, I used to read like these books of like missionaries and stuff. But then one that came to mind, I remember reading her books and stuff. I don't know if you've heard of Helen Keller. Like she ended up like coming down with like a sickness that like when she was really young, and she ended up being blind and deaf, and she came to like overcome like a lot of her challenges. And she, I just thought it was really cool. Like I read her story of like how much like she had to go through, yet she turned like what she did with her life was like pretty pretty remarkable, and like how out of all the, you would think it's almost like impossible with what she had and her illnesses, but yeah.
And Catherine, hero that you have?
I really love Corrie ten Boom. It started when I was a child, and my mother was watching the movie The Hiding Place. She read the book, and I couldn't sleep one night, and I saw her crying, and I never saw her crying watching the movie. And so at the age of about 9 or 10, she told me Corrie's story, and I've read all of her books, and I just love the fact that her family very quietly, without much fuss, stood up and did what they thought Jesus would want them to do. They went against the state. They were punished for it. And Corrie was the only one who survived the concentration camp, and then had to, you know, she said to God, I'll go anywhere, but don't make me go back to Germany. And of course, she went back there, and her preaching was just sublime. And although she passed away when I was a child, one of the poems she often quoted, I actually quoted at my mother's Thanksgiving service after she passed away just over a year ago, because it had such an effect on my life. You know, the poem called The Tapestry, or some will know it as The Weaver. But I just love that. You know, I love Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but his life was, you know, he was a scholar, whereas Corrie was just an everyday, normal, middle-aged woman who stood up against the Nazi regime because of Jesus. And she, you know, was victor in the end. She did such amazing things, going and preaching in prisons when she herself had been in prison for something that wasn't what we would call wrong. So yeah, that affects me. I hope that, and thank God we live in Australia, but I'd like to think that if I ever saw anything like that and the way people suffer, that I would stand up for that quietly in my faith in Jesus, just because God has called us.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that. Jade and then Matthew. Yeah, these are powerful stories that we're reading, such as Corrie ten Boom. Jade and then Matthew. Jade, who's your hero?
Hello there. Yeah, I think Corrie ten Boom's story was really nicely just summarized just there. I always, I think out of any of the stories from like that I read, you know, over my lifetime, you know, yeah, it was always just a really strong one, and Corrie and her sister Betsy. I won't get into it because we've just heard all about that. Thank you very much for that, by the way. So yeah, that was just a really beautiful story, really powerful.
Yeah, thank you. And Matthew, who's your hero that you'd like to reflect on?
I think can't go past Jesus, but you know, I tried to. He's my hero, and as far as trying to imitate somebody, he's my very top rank. But I think I identify more with Peter because he's more like one of us. With all of his flaws, he wasn't perfect like Jesus, and you know, if anyone's going to put their foot in their mouth, it's Peter. And you know, he kind of blew it in so many different ways, yet in the end, he was the one who also led the church after Jesus' ascension, and became, you know, and ultimately also died a martyr. So yeah, he's a pretty.
That's a great example there, and leads on to our next thought, Matthew. Thanks for that. Paul Ricoeur talks about two types of identity. There is the stable identity that's carried through, and then there is the changing sense of identity. Many of the great stories that we read are stories of transformation and change. You can think of Moses and the Exodus that we'll look at. You can think of Adam and Eve. And also, as you've mentioned, Matthew, thanks for that, with Peter. We see there as someone who's wrestling with different ways in which he sees himself, and he even denies Christ. And so Paul Ricoeur says a good story will communicate some of this wrestling within. Others who've written about narrative and identity include Alistair MacIntyre. He's one of the founding figures in the modern narrativity movement. And Charles Taylor has also written as a philosopher on the relationship between identity and the narratives that we tell one another. And so there's a distinction between an experience of oneself, and then there's also other ways in which that is seen. That is, there's self in relation to others, in relation to God and to mystery and mission. There's also self in relation to smaller narratives, but grander narratives. What are the large narratives that we're a part of? And we'll see that all the narratives of the Bible fit with a Genesis to Revelation big narrative of what God is doing. And that fits with the big thoughts we might have about what's God's big purpose in this world. There is a bit of an evangelical emphasis on God's just saving individual people, but I think many scholars would say, no, God is doing something within communities, within families, that's multi-generational, that goes on much longer and much larger, and doing something within nations. And so there's a much bigger purpose that we see described in Scripture from Genesis to Revelation. So what else do stories do for us? They give us a plot, they give us character, but they also can transport us into the story world, and then we can return. They give us a sense of identification, people we identify with, and then people that we don't want to be like at all. And so there are different characters within a narrative that communicate in different ways. In Out of Africa, Karen Blixen said, to be a person is to have a story to tell. And I think that's important whenever we're introducing ourselves, communicating, then we probably have a story to tell. My father's family lived in England, and in the early 1950s, after World War II, things were a bit sad there. So he decided to come to Australia as a bit of an engineer and work on building trains. And he met my mother, and her parents were Anglican ministers who came out from England, and they met in Tasmania and got married. And I was the eldest of about 7 children. And then I became a science teacher because I think science is wonderful. And then after a while, I thought science is okay and maths is okay, 2 + 2. But what's really interesting is during the lunch hour, talking to people about God and Jesus and these other areas. So eventually I went on to become a chaplain in schools and a minister, pastored the church for 4 or 5 years or a bit longer, and then teaching Bible. And then since then, I've always had a fascination with the way in which Bible brings a sense of life and meaning to people. That is, we identify with the story. So I've had many, many years of interest there. Led me to go on and do a master's degree at the University of Queensland in the arts, but also in the Bible as well. And then I was going to do a PhD in Bible, but I did my PhD on contemporary churches in Australia. So I was interested. So if you want to Google Sam Hain churches, then find some things I've done there. So there's a story that I tell. Of course, I met my wife playing tennis, and then it was love all, and then we got married, and then had 3 kids, and now I've got 6 grandkids. And so there's stories that we each tell, and there's probably mountaintop good experiences, and then there's more challenging experiences as we go along. So we all have a story to tell, and I think the stories we read speak into the stories that we identify with, and particularly the biblical stories as Christians very much speak to us, but also speak to the Western world that we live in. Aristotle explained that the human being living in a real world has rational powers, dual nature, we're embodied, but we have a soul, we think and we engage, not only in the embodied world, but I think there is this other world, a mental world, where we imagine. And so we live in these different worlds, don't we? And I guess that's why we like Netflix or whatever it is that you subscribe to, because we can step into other worlds. Unless you're a student, you probably don't have time for such things. But, and so stories can really carry us. This raises questions, of course, whether written stories are a bit different to the stories we watch as well. There's something about a written story that captures the imagination and gets the mind working, that just watching or listening to a story doesn't do quite the same. A quote from Carl, I was going to Death in the Family, part of his 6-volume autobiography, and we could think here about whether my students could even write autoethnographies or biographies about themselves. My struggle, you know, too little and it doesn't exist, you know too much and it doesn't exist. Writing is drawing the essence of what we know out of the shadows. That is what writing is about, not what happens there, not what actions are played out, but there itself. That is writing's location name. I think there is something wonderful about writing, that you discover things about yourself and discover things about the world. And I think a lot of people who are writers because it extends themselves in some ways. And I think when we study, we do much the same. And even in this subject, I hope that each time, each week, you engage with ideas that enlarge you, that open up ways of thinking, ways of imagining, that help you to be an enlarged person, to live a larger life. And I think literature does that. It enlarges people. And I think the Bible has been written in many ways to enlarge us. In Poetic Justice, Martha Nussbaum writes on the importance of narrative and novels for the cultivation of what she calls the literary imagination, something she believes in the aid of cultivation of ethical and political theories that allow us to thrive in democratic societies. Nussbaum says that for democratic societies to function well, for it to properly take into account the lives of citizens during the creation of institutions, laws and policies, requires an individual who composes that society possesses a particular type of skill that she calls the literary imagination. So she would say part of good education is to have literature that you can engage with. And I think the collectors of the 66 books of the Bible were collecting books that are to engage the people that engage with them. And many people say Bible can change you and transform you. I know myself and family members read a chapter of Bible each day. Sometimes they don't speak to us so much, but many times they challenge us to think a bit more. And in many ways, we dialogue with it. We hear a bit, but then we bring our ideas back and we share them. And so I think there's a dialogue takes place when you read, when you write. The other thing I'd like to encourage you to do is to be open to the creative. When we do the Psalms in a few weeks' time, you might want to think about writing a poem yourself. When you think about the stories that we are looking at, you might want to think about, could you write a creative piece? Now, it's not a creative writing class in that sense, but I think in some ways the Bible is creative literatures and God's made us as creative people, and sometimes it would be good to be challenged a bit to write a little bit. And so if you find yourself able to put together a little short story about good and evil, then worth wrestling with. Part of it's learning to think, isn't it? It's wrestling with these concepts and ideas that we read about and then reflect upon. One of the things that I could briefly mention is that we live in a modern age, which Charles Taylor, people come across the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, He says that we live in an imminent age. Up until about 100 years or so ago, it was possible to imagine God and angels and things like that. And then about 1880 or so, someone discovered measuring tapes and weighing machines and started measuring everything. And so since that time, you don't imagine things anymore. You work in a factory that manufactures things, and you think in that certain way. So we've lost some of that encouragement of imagination and seeing that which is beyond us, the phenomenology that the French talk about, that is believing in these things, you know, God being amongst us. And I believe God is amongst us, and we speak to him, hear him there. So modernity is the age in which we live, and sometimes that contrasts with the other ages that we can compare with. We haven't had a lot of time today to go into the art of the biblical narrative chapter on Tamar, which is chapter 38. So if you read the material in your reading, there's some good material there on the Tamar narrative. And one of the big questions that Robert Alter asks is, why is that chapter there one chapter after Joseph, and chapter 37 through to chapter 50? I mean, and he says it's put there for a reason, as every little narrative is. And of course, you remember the big story of Joseph. You may have thoughts as to what we can learn from someone who brags about his father loving him, puts on the Technicolor coat, and then the brothers turn against him and he gets rejected and thrown into a pit and goes through prison times. One of the interesting things is that Joseph narrative resonates with the biblical narrative that we're going to pick up with later. That is the whole 11 tribes of Israel. In 722 BC, the Assyrians come down and wipe them out. Bash, 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 bash. And they have disappeared. So if anyone knows where the 11 missing tribes are during the break, if you tell me, then no more will be said about this matter. But we've lost 11 tribes. There are people in Ethiopia saying we're one of them. There are people in the highlands of Papua New Guinea who say we just happen to have discovered we're one of the 11 tribes. But that may be more creative writing than actually what's happened. But one tribe survived, which is the tribe of Judah. And about 150 years later, they were taken into captivity in 586 BC by the Babylonians, and then they returned. But isn't that similar to the Joseph story? And so there's these resonating stories through the Bible of captivity and return. And perhaps it's even a little bit similar to the Jonah story. That is, he goes down into a whale and then comes out of the whale. I said before, you could write a story. One way you could write a story would be to start with a setting. The Jonah story, it starts with fishermen going out, and that's the setting, isn't it? And then each of these stories often begins with a setting. Other people begin a story with a character, and other people begin a story with a plot, and some people begin just the beginning of the plot, but they haven't quite decided where it will go, and they just unfold it. So there's different ways in which stories unfold, and perhaps life is a bit like that as well. I think if you're going to make a story work, you've got to have the unexpected in there. And so people don't want a story that's just the obvious. They want a story that's unexpected. And that's what holds your interest. You don't know what's going to happen next. And in some ways, the Bible uses these methods. One thing I would say is that the Bible is not just story. The Bible is truth. Just like I said, my parents could write me a letter. The letter is not just the letter reflects someone who is there. And I think as a Christian, the Bible reflects the God who speaks to us, who's at work in the world, and it gives us information that is there. It gives us wisdom. We'll see that in the Proverbs, that if you do the right thing, you'll be blessed. But it also mentions grace and love and forgiveness. If you do the wrong thing, then I'll still love you, and then maybe we can get together and work this through. So the Bible has these different narratives that are there. And so these are going to be different aspects that we're going to look at in the weeks ahead. So in the weeks ahead, we're going to go on next week to look at the book of Genesis more fully and deeply. We'll look at good and evil. So there's a bit of homework as to give some thought as to what is the nature of good and evil. And you may be interested in wrestling through that question and what is Genesis 1, 2 and 3 tell us about good and evil. One of the interesting clues I'll give you is that we often read Genesis 3 without looking at Genesis 4. And there's a possibility that we should read Genesis 3 and 4 together, and maybe the whole of Genesis 1 to 11 together. That is, sometimes we quickly move over evil as Adam and Eve, they eat the fruit and then they are removed from the garden. But we see the nature of evil continue to be described with Cain and Abel. That is, brother turns against brother. And then we have the question of the flood. And so there's questions about good and evil that we could be wrestling with. And this raises the question, what is the nature of evil? Is evil the absence of good? God's made a world good. How do we end up in evil? And then how's it resolved and worked through? So we're going to wrestle a bit more with that next week, because I think that's one of the major themes we see in any story, is that a murder mystery begins with a murder. Sometimes within the first 2 minutes the person is dead, and then you're working out what goes on. One of the interesting things we might touch on in weeks ahead, did you know that a number of people who've written detective stories have been Christians? That is, there's some parallels. Have you come across that concept before? Or yeah. Yes. Yes. And that raises different types of Christian approaches too. As you've got the Catholic Irish writers, and then the English writers, possibly a bit similar from an Anglican background. So different traditions may in fact give different ways of writing detective stories. But I think detective stories resonate with that question, what's right, what's justice, how do we deal with the big failures that take place? And that's quite a strong religious theme. And so I think there are some parallels there that we may look at. There are also hero stories. The Superman story. Can anyone know the origins of Superman? From a Jewish writer whose father, I think, was shot in a robbery. And so he carried this question in his subconscious and in his conscious mind as to how do you deal with a world where things can go wrong and people can shoot bullets at other people. And so he comes up with this Jewish narrative of Superman and Clark Kent. And so there are interesting connections between the Bible and Christian authors and what we read. And then there are interesting connections with the power of the Bible and the Word of God to change and transform lives for good. So there's some of the things that lie ahead. A reminder that you have to do 2 posts. We said if you choose to do Genesis, you've got a couple of weeks to put a short 150 words up on that. And then, so for next week, do think further about those areas that will be looked at in the assignment. And then we'll put up some other resources here. You might want to think a little bit more about Joseph in Genesis 37 to 50. That's quite important for us there. I've also put up Tim Bulkeley speaks about fraught with background, the biblical narrative, which is mentioned here, but it's a reading, Odysseus Scar by Eric Auerbach. I'd like you to think a bit more about this, but the point being made there is that if you read Greek literature like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, it will say, this person has done a bad thing, he is a bad person. But if you read Abraham sacrificing Isaac, It won't tell us whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. It'll say, God said, Abraham, take your son and sacrifice him. And immediately we're thinking, that this is the God who says, thou shalt not kill. What's going on here? And so you're wrestling with that as you begin. And then Abraham takes him and lays him down. Yeah. So how many people have read a little bit of Odysseus' Scar, Eric Orberg? Have you given some thought to what he's saying there with Odysseus' Scar?
I think it is more about first chapter of after this and after more than I need to.
Yeah. Yeah, let's while you're thinking about that, let's come back in 2 or 3 minutes time and reconnect. Our video is going to run out at this stage. So let's